Thanks everyone for coming and hang out with us today. Really happy to be here. Obviously coming over to Amsterdam is a great privilege, so yeah, let's get into it. My name is Brett Morris. I'm a motion design director. Originally from Australia, now I live in Los Angeles. And I've had a great experience at a studio called Capacity for the past 5 years, but just recently stepped over into the freelance market. So kind of new chapter of my life, and with that, I got to make a new show reel. So let's just have a look at this, and then we'll get stuck into it.
New York, it's beyond 5 boroughs. It's worldwide. This is that. Rappers, Allen, Knox, whipping rap flow for them box, spitting being monsters, sniffing that blow. Block huggers know the style, triple that dough. 40 cal for them cocksuckers, sit them back slow. What y'all know about boat pies? Get them that low. I'm out before the boat top. Simple cash flow, rap been wide, no lie. My side is a Tabasco, so hot. Crooked cops are searching your asshole with the drop. The freeze niggas right where they stand for the guap. Niggas will play pocket, popping their man, it don't stop. We up top, where we lock the land, and Evo block, we throw shop, get ghosts and scram. Gingerbread niggas on the run from feds. Shit is sick, pretty chicks will put a gun to your head, never a Vic. Either think quick or end up dead, cause when we flip, what's left to be said? Yo, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York. Living in the city, living in the city. New York, living in the city, living in the city, kid. New York.
All right, thank you, thank you. So yeah, I do motion design. I'm heavily involved with the creative, but I also take pride in the technical abilities that I've been able to achieve in cinema. So the project that I'm going to be talking about today is kind of like a combination of both. You know, I've been doing motion design for about 10 years now, and this is kind of the combination of years and years and years of experience and putting it all together in a personal project. Really special process that I'm really happy to talk about here today. So skip back into the presentation. So yeah, the motion response is it's an initiative that's held by the Pause Fest, which is a design and technology conference that happens in Melbourne of Australia every year. And so they invite 10 independent studios or designers to contribute, just like a 2-minute animation. And this year it was Discover Your Future Self, and that's what we made for it. So today's presentation, it's kind of like a one part of two. I'm speaking tomorrow afternoon, and so this presentation I'm mostly going to be talking about like the bust, a lot of the animation styles that went into creating some of those animations. Tomorrow it's going to be a little bit of an overflow, but also some landscape generation that happened. So if you can make it tomorrow, we'll cover the rest of the topics. So our hero bust is kind of the catalyst for all of visuals. And I searched high and low for different types of styles of sculpting through all the ages, Roman, Greek, and I couldn't quite find anything that just had the right style that I was looking for until I discovered a model on TurboSquid. So there was actually a model that we could just purchase straight from TurboSquid, and it just had the right aesthetic. It had everything that I was looking for to use in the piece. But the downside that it came through in a totally triangulated form that we're looking here on the left. And it's fine for rendering, but when it comes to animation, you kind of want to be working with like a little bit more of a an appropriate mesh. So here on the left is the triangulated form, and you can see there's a lot of pinching that's coming up in the eyes, the cheeks and the neck. It's like a little bit spread out. But one of the collaborators on the project, Patrick Goski, who's actually part of the Maxon family, he jumped on board, and his first task was just retopologizing the model. So, just rebuilding the form of the model with correct edge flow really sets us up for production. We don't have to worry about any sort of like over calculations or anything that's going to cause problems when we're running simulations, because we're dealing with a quality mesh. And part of the workflow that we had in this project was utilizing the sculpting tag for cinema. So what we're looking at the right-hand side is just an increased subdivision count that we're using on the sculpting tag. And the other benefit of using the sculpting tag is once you get to a certain level, you can actually have different variations of the sculpt itself. And so this is what we're looking at here. The central model is the hero, but at any point, using the same sculpting tag, we could kind of make him younger or older based on Patrick's sculpting. So to start off, I'm just going to open up Cinema and kind of show you exactly how this looks. Okay, so when this pops up, okay, so this is what we're looking at, kind of like the low mesh. It's not the most beautiful mesh, but the form is there, and at least we can see exactly what's happening. So this was kind of like the basis of a lot of the animation rigs. It was light, it was affordable on the processing, but at any point in time, depending on what the shot was, we just come over into the sculpting tag and increase the subdivisions. So with every increase of the subdivisions, we get more fidelity in the model, and also allowed the sculpting tools to have more of an impact. And so once we hit up to the subdivision level 4, just switching over to edge mode, it's completely compressed with detail. And for rendering, this was absolutely ideal. The younger and older iteration is just, you can see it's labeled in the window there. If I just check on that and give some space, it was just easy enough that we could just switch through the age variations without having separate models. So it was just really helpful for Patrick to send over a new model. I would just attach the sculpting tag to the new model, and I had all of his updated work. And so while this was all happening, I was kind of on my end developing all the R&D and trying to figure out exactly how we were going to bring to life these animations. So the first topic, or first animation rig that we're going to talk about is the sliced head. So in the sequence, we've got a cam full of shots. There's definitely some like interesting things that are happening in the model, but I didn't know how to get there at the beginning. So it was just an iterative process of just building, learning, failing at different setups and refining the process as we went along. But I try and work in a procedural way as much as I can, because it allows me to basically take a new model, an updated model that Patrick would send me, and all of my work just listens to it and it abides by it, and I don't need to like recreate things over and over again. So that's kind of what I'm going to break down first, is just the whole creation of this setup. So there's a lot of layers of information that are going to go into this rig. So I kind of want to start with a clean scene and just kind of build it up layer by layer. So at least as I open up the more complex scenes, we kind of know exactly what's happening, because there's going to be a lot of espresso, there's going to be some like MoGraph, foam MoGraph, and some modeling as well. So simply, the setup is based around the hierarchy iterator. And so I'm just going to change the name of this to iterator, and just add a espresso tag. So the whole concept behind this system was just using a parent object and allowing that parent object to control all the parameters of the children. So all I want to do for this stage is just set an output object, and also create a new node, espresso hierarchy. Now, just the way I tend to work, I like to manually control my hierarchy with the object. It does it by default, just with the relative reference. But for me, just knowing for sure that that's connected helps me sleep at night. So what I want to do is create an object. Now, it's just a default cube, nothing special about it. But all of the objects inside Cinema have this basic tab. And so for this example, I'm just going to affect the name. And all I need to do is just drag the cube in, set it to object mode, connect the hierarchy to the object. And so this is basically overriding the cube object. We're now looking at an empty object node that any object that goes into the hierarchy, we've now got the power to control it. So I'm going to set a secondary input, and I just want to go to basics name. Now, the whole idea is simplifying a really complex task. So on my iterator, I just want to set up like a new group and call this control. And here is where I'm going to kind of put my parenting parameters to control, many objects depending on how we set it up. And just by adding a new set of data, call this name and string. All we've done is just come over here to our iterator null, it's a control tab, and we've now got a string field. So if we drag this to our iterator and now connect these two together, nothing's going to happen because there's nothing, there's no children of this iterator null at the moment. But as soon as I add an object to it, it's going to populate the parameter. So I can now basically create any object, doesn't matter which name they are, and when I come over to my iterator and just say, hello, Mario, any of these objects that I put as a child, when I can select them correctly, they all just populate with hello, Mario. So this is just like a really quick and easy way to illustrate what the iterator does. I'm going to open up the next scene, which is, it's not quite the production scene, but there's a couple of more elements. And as I'm breaking this down, I'm hoping that I can kind of build on the previous one so you guys are following along when we get into the complex scene where there's a lot going on. OK, so in our sliced start, all we're looking at here is just a platonic. Now the platonic, it's just display tab just to make it a little bit easier to see through it. And all we have here is a sliced rig. You can see I've got a couple of different parameters. We're doing a Y start, a thickness, and a gap. Now, they're the controls that I'm going to use to basically control many different extrudes in this setup. And the Espresso looks a little bit different. It's, if I can get it, there's a couple more nodes in there, but really all that's happening is we've got our sliced rig null. It's being connected to the hierarchy. We're running the hierarchy into an object index so we can actually control every iterated index value of every object that's coming into it. So then that way we can use some extra variables like our thickness, our gap, and our Y start to multiply against their index number. So all of them are spaced equally apart. They can all be controlled by the thickness. And I don't need to do any extra work when I'm creating this. And you'll see that just by having this little Espresso setup saves me tons of time when I'm trying to process different ideas, because the creative is always evolving. And as you do a little bit of a technical stuff, you kind of want to make sure that your creative is still at the forefront and the most important part of the project. So jumping over to here, the next object down is my extrude. Now, I don't have anything in it at the moment, and I just wanted to start this from scratch so you could see the process and how it all kind of talks to each other. So our circle spline as a child, once I split this over to the correct plane, we can see our platonic, it's not reacting to it, and that's just because we don't have a shrink wrap. Once we add the shrink wrap deformer, any object that we add to this target object and switch over to the correct target source, we're now shrinking the spline against the object. So it's pretty straightforward, but you can see that I've got one, and we really need many. So if I duplicate this out, I'm still retaining the same spline, shrink wrapping on the object, but these objects are totally independent from each other, and I can just do this all day. So I'm already starting to do like a little bit of a manual sort of process by duplicating and adjusting manually on the height. And as I was kind of exploring different options, I was playing with different sort of extrude levels, like how far apart they should be from each other. And this was kind of the point in the project that I knew I needed to build something that would systemize this for me. So everything that we've kind of learned with the iterator, we've set these controls up to control certain aspects of these objects. They aren't part of this sliced rig yet. So as soon as I drop this over, they're going to format to the parameters that we've set. And if I go back to the parameters on the sliced rig, we have the Y start, which adjusts them all together. We've got a thickness, which will just offset the thickness from each other, and then the gap between them as well. And so quickly, it's pretty simple to set up. You can see that once we kind of hit the threshold of the object, the spline starts to react because it's got nothing to hold on to. But if we kind of set it down the bottom, all I need to do from now on is just duplicate the objects, and if they're still part of the sliced rig, that will just populate and format to exactly where they need to be based on their index value. And you can see I have one too many, so if I just delete one, it just formats together. So that's kind of like the basis of how this whole setup was built. And I have one extra step above it, which is the actual production file, once we get this open, that now that we've kind of looked at how this whole espresso rig's set up, this is the actual working file that I was using to finish this piece. So we're looking at the bust mesh and just turning it on in edge mode. You can see this is the low polygon count that we had. It's kind of our base mesh that we use for everything. Just importing this in, setting it to line mode. You can see I've got this sliced extrude down the bottom. I turn them on and might actually just turn the bust off. You can see that this sliced extrude is abiding by the mesh. So if I kind of go from the bottom, you've got this like nice cross-section of the mesh, and again, it's just a duplicating process where you can just make as many as you want, drop in inside of this fracture, and they all abide by the espresso. So, you can see that as I'm duplicating as well, the duplicating name is being overwritten, and that's just because I've got a constant string just saying that any child of this object has to be called slice. It's just one of those little things that I add into my workflow so I know exactly what I'm searching for when I need to search for something quickly. And yeah, it's just a matter of just duplicating this out, so many times until it fills out, and it only really works on the top level. And let's just do one more. Okay, so there's our bust, and he's almost fully formed. The great thing about working in a live manner like this is the ability to just have all your rotation controls still live. So just from an art direction point of view, it just looked a lot easier on the eyes if this was all angled up, just because the, there was a lot more detail that we were able to read with the splines, and it just looked a lot cooler. So you can see that, yeah, again, like the way the spline is being mapped to like a concave surface isn't ideal. And at a certain point, I had to, bake a couple of these splines out and actually, kind of manually model the spline to get the form correct. So there was like a little bit of manual work, but my whole philosophy is if I can do the bulk of the work quickly and easily, I don't mind, spending that manual time doing cleanup when it's needed. So let's just turn this back off. Okay, so you may have noticed I had everything dropped inside of a fracture object, and this is just kind of that extra layer of control that you can add into your piece just because you can utilize all the MoGraph tools. So when we turn the fracture object on, we've now turned all of these iterated extrudes into kind of like a pseudo clone. So we can now use like a random position, and you can see everything offset a little bit. But if we boost that parameter up a little bit, even say 5, you can see now that we've got everything reacting. And the great thing is the whole espresso still holds up. So if we wanted to, change the thickness or anything, it's going to go through every single one of those extrudes, update the parameters, and then the fracture overrides it, and then now we've got this random control on everything. So, pretty helpful. I just felt like, you always want to throw more and more at it, because the more control you have, the more you can control the art direction of it. And then also adding a color shader into the mix. I'm just going to kill one of them, or a couple of them maybe. Just that one up the top. So the random color was basically just piping in a different color value for every single clone. So it was easy enough just to create, just a multi-layered shader inside of, Octane, and pipe in different gray values. And so when we look at the final piece again, you can see that while it's subtle, every single slice has a different gray value in the texture that's being used. So it was just something I got for free by adding it to a fracture object. So, just like little things that you can add into the mix certainly help, alleviate any sort of extra work. And then lastly, because this was all based on like a shrink wrap on an object, we can still deform that object post of everything that's happening. So inside of my bust, I've got this displacer, and that's going to really mess with the object. And that's also live as well. And I'm a little bit hesitant to press play. There's actual noise movement in the shader. So all of these splines will actually interact with the model itself. It's just running it off a little MacBook. I'm not totally sure it's going to live to play through it correctly. So yeah, just a little bit of an insight in how I approached that system. It was definitely, an iterative process, figuratively and literally. So yeah, hope that kind of sheds some light on how that was built. And next up is the head explode. So in the piece, we're kind of just looking at this shot. Now during the storyboarding phase, when this frame was created, we knew that this was going to be just like a big epic moment of the piece. But because we had, this end section that was kind of like in this anti-gravity white space, this was going to be kind of like a punch in the middle of the sequence. It had to be really impactful. So, stylistically, it was something that we were really excited to attempt, but technically it was going to be quite a challenge because it needed to feel very organic, it needed to flow nicely, and we needed a lot of control over the animation. So there's actually quite a lot of different steps and different assets that are going into this particular shot, but today I'm just going to be talking about the actual geometry exploding. So if we open up our scene, okay, so the whole approach to this particular effect was driven by the cloth engine. So the cloth engine is super powerful for any sort of character work with any real clothing attached to it, but it can be used in many different ways, and you can manipulate it quite easily. It's not the most complex tool, but it can do really complex work. So the driving force behind this whole simulation to work was based on Vertex Maps. So what we're looking at here is just the first pass of the Vertex Maps. And you can see I've just got like a quick outline around the eyelid. And this is kind of like the starting point of where the cloth is actually going to kind of take over. And you'll notice that I'm actually working with the Triangulated Mesh. Now this was just something that happened naturally. We kind of used the subdivided mesh, but because it was evenly distributed around the face, it was a little bit too clean when it broke up. So having the kind of older mesh to play with was, we used it to our advantage, because having all that extra detail around the eyes, and then, it's kind of a little bit more sparse on the cheek, kind of gave like a really interesting effect, because lots of detail were coming out, but then the cheeks were like really pulling apart in a much wider fashion. So you'll notice that I've got a couple of objects underneath my face, and what we're looking at is Nitro Vertex toolset. And if you guys haven't used it before, I highly recommend it. In the past, we've been able to do like similar effects, but it's been a little bit tricky. You know, some much smarter people than I have written some really cool like Python tags that expand the vertex map. But now it's way more approachable and way more easier to manage. So the first one we've got here is the Nitro Vertex Fx. You can see our output is a grow vertex map, which we're looking at here. It's the second one. And the import source is the start, so our kind of painted eyelid. So what's going to happen, it's basically just going to expand out the vertex map's values based on wherever we're starting it from. And if I just kind of pull out and press play, you'll see it animates pretty quickly, and we're getting that for free, basically, with these tools. So pretty cool effect. You can play with the timing, you can play with the smoothing, but lucky enough for this effect, just straight out of the box, default parameters worked perfectly for what we needed it for. So I mentioned that it's all driven with the cloth engine, and the way the cloth can be manipulated is through belts. So the whole idea between this system is there's a belt in the middle of the head. It's just a single geometry, piece of geometry. And what happens is the belt connects a connection to every single vertex in the cloth object, but we use the influence to release that. So with our belt, which we can see, we're looking at this new vertex map called belt, which is the third one, and the influence is 100%. So what we were looking at a moment ago was a vertex map that starts off in red, which is actually 0, and the 100% is represented by the yellow. So, we kind of need to invert that because we want to start with 100%. We want to reduce it down to 0 so the influence can release the point position of the vertex and the cloth can take over. So we just have a Nitro Vertex replace, and it's simply just inverting the values. So now we just start with a full 100%, and we're animating down to 0. So what that looks like is, when we jump over to our cloth tag, is it's going to look a little wild on this first pass. And I've got this cached, actually, so it's going to play back a little bit faster for us. But you'll see that as that animation pulls through the face, we're basically just releasing all the points. Now, it looks pretty gnarly because we don't have the cloth surface turned on. But just that idea that this vertex map that we're creating is actually releasing the points. Oh, sorry, I turned this off. So if we just watch that back again. So anywhere that it's red, we're releasing. OK, so again, looks pretty wild. It's certainly not what we want to look at. And simply just adding it into a cloth surface cleans all that up. And based on the parameters that I'm going to look at in a second, we're actually driving the animation and we're controlling the tear. So out of the box, this is a pretty simple cloth engine setup. All parameters are pretty much default. The only thing I've amped up is the tear value. So that's just basically saying once tension hits a certain point between the points, release. And if you've got a cloth surface there, it's going to look at that release and it's going to actually pull them apart from each other. And the results are pretty self-explanatory. With the forces, everything's been turned down to 0 except for wind in Z. So that way, we're just pushing in a Z direction, which is pushing all the cloth forward. So basically, it's just setting up a cloth simulation and controlling that simulation with the vertex maps. And it's pretty much as simple as that. It was a pretty fun shot to figure out. And thankfully, we have the right tools at our disposal to make a shot like this happen. And if we kind of go back a little bit, you can start to see that the way that the cloth is breaking up is it's not that easy on the eye, and it's because we're using this triangulated surface. So at the camera distance that we had for rendering, it's not terrible. It's passable just because there's so much detail there. But just an extra step above it, dropping in a subdivision surface, kind of just rounds out all the edges, and you just get like much more of a natural, organic sort of feel to the breaking apart of the geometry. And again, at camera distance that we rendered at, it's pretty nice. Actually, this is much slower just because of the hypernerbs. Well, subdivision is turned on, but you can see it's it's quite nice and organic. And if you take note of like specifically around the eyes and relation to the cheek, you'll start to see those chunks are starting to break through in much wider sort of distribution opposed to really clumped up together. So yeah, so this was this is a pretty fun shot to work on. Now there's obviously a lot more information that's going into this final shot, and I don't think I have the full time I'd need to actually talk about every single layer, so I just wanted to show a quick render blast of what else was created that went into it. So this is all X particles. This is just a trail system. This is a kind of like a spawning system, and then a couple of like simple minimal turbulence sort of affections. And then this is also a turbulence SD pass. So all of them together, in context, looks kind of crazy, but in the composite, we kind of laid them all out, choreographed them, definitely kind of balanced them out against each other. Like some of them are toned back completely, but it's probably about 10 different passes, all different methods. And once you get it through composite and you put it in some context in the sequence, it's a pretty cool moment. So yeah, really happy to kind of pull back the curtain and show how we made this one. Okay, so the end melt is basically like the big hero of the piece. This was certainly like a very daunting challenge at the beginning. I wasn't totally sure how we were going to approach this. We had some style frames where we basically, used the liquid pen in Photoshop and just made it do what we wanted to do. But when it came to time for production, there was just, I don't know, there was a big question mark about how we would actually approach this. So, I kind of mentioned our workflow, which was, or our, production team. It was myself and Steve in Los Angeles, and Patrick was over in Montreal. And so Patrick was taking care of all the sculpting. Steve and I were working on the design, the edit, a lot of the 2D assets like the typography, and all the 3D as well. So while we're on our end, we're just trying to figure out exactly, how everything that we want to make is going to get made. And one of my first attempts of making this kind of like pseudo liquid / soft body effect was actually with X particles. And I wanted to bring this up because this is, it's the R&D process. You end up making a lot more than you actually use, but everything that you learn along the way ultimately goes towards the bigger goal. But in this case, it was complete throwaway, but I was kind of looking at this system where I could have geometry, and using some X particles would basically trigger some modifiers that would then be able to like morph the geometry. And it's pretty light. Like I'm just moving this attractor around, and I'm getting like a pretty wild sort of bit of motion out of it. It's basically an X particle system that's looking at this sphere. It's then creating some particles on each vertex, and then those particles are being affected with just a simple setup of a trigger, which releases their motion into a different group, and we've got some turbulence and a tractor. But what happens is we have this kind of deformer stack on our sphere where, at the surface level, nothing is happening. But with the combination of adding, displacer, twist deformer, we're starting to get like a little bit of a surface movement. And then we have this particle deformer, which is actually looking at the first particle group that we created, and it's then applying those particles as a deformer to the geometry. So here I was able to, play around and do some, weird stuff with it. And then it's stacking on jiggles, bends, smoothing, all sorts of stuff to, ultimately get this kind of like very natural, movement in the surface. I think I could have taken a lot further, but what happened was, while I'm in this world and I'm playing around and I'm starting to maybe get some headway on the shot, Patrick decides to send us this. And this basically changed the game completely for us. We had one conversation over Skype, and we had the animatic. We also had some references, and it was a pretty quick conversation. We didn't go terribly into detail because I think Patrick was like a little bit on the fence about attempting it, but we talked it through. We were like, no, we can do this, we can do this. Anyway, a couple of days later, he sent us this, and to me, I just think this is absolutely wonderful, and I was just beyond stoked to see that this sculpture that Patrick made was going to be the hero of the piece. So here I was playing with this like X-particle system, trying to figure out how I was going to make it. I look at this and I'm thinking, we're going to do that. Like, I don't even want to mess with that. And so to me, it was all about keeping the integrity of the sculpture. I didn't want to lose any of the quality of it. The detail level is terrific. And so, once we composed the shots, we realized that in the sequence, it's quite short, but we needed some movement to it. There was no way we were just going to leave a static sculpture in there. So I knew I didn't need to worry about the fluid side of this breaking apart, but still need to bring it to life. So the last scene that we're going to kind of break down is the animation scene that we had for the actual animation of this sculpture. And there's some interesting things going on with it, so I thought it was worth talking about. There's definitely some like workflow philosophies that you could kind of implement into your own work based on what we were trying to achieve with this. And it's taking a second to open just because the cache file is like 2 gigs. So, okay, so what we're looking at here is the sculpture. And when we go back to edge mode, we're looking at that like low polygon version. So this was the starting point for Patrick. Just that very base level, getting the form right. We still had all the ability to increase the subdivision, but for animation, it was way more important to make this as cheap as possible to animate on the computer processing, opposed to dealing with the high polygon count, which would just take hours and hours to process because it's just such a large volume of data to process. So going back to this kind of low polygon model, the idea was let's handle all the animation on this. That way we've got feedback, we can iterate through ideas, we can see everything in the viewport, and then we'll mesh it, we'll use a mesh deformer to the high sculpting polygon count down the line. So if I just press play, you'll notice that everything that's a child of these objects is turned off. So what we're looking at now is just keyframe animation. So the whole scene is kind of like a zero gravity scene. There needed to be this moment where the geometry was pulling apart from each other, because the idea was we were coming into this scene, there's like a hard rotation, and that's kind of like split the face apart, and that's when we're getting like this, opposing rotation. So there didn't need to be a lot of animation, but it just needed to be enough that in the shots, it made sense. So yeah, this is just hand keyframe animation, and I'm actually going to turn these off while we just focus on this top one for a minute. So earlier I was talking about Vertex Maps and how I like to use them. This is a different method, and if you paint an area that you would like to deform, you can use that Vertex Map to control a deformer. So it's quite simple to add a deformer to your scene and apply your vertex to the restriction. It's basically just going to restrict that deformer to the points that you allow it to affect based on the vertex point value. And the first one we've got in the stack is a Jiggle Deformer. And Jiggle Deformer is great for kind of adding an extra layer of animation to any point level animation. It kind of interpolates between the points, and you can add more kind of like a rubbery sort of jello sort of feel to it. And one of the great things about the Jiggle is that you can actually just apply like particle modifiers to it, so you can kind of get free point level animation just by using all your regular standard particle modifiers. So if I turn this on, we're not really going to get any effect because we need to turn the particle modifiers on. If I just turn these two rotators on, you'll see that we're getting an extra bit of a pull around the top half of the head, especially with all the goo that's coming off it, and that's explicitly controlled with this map. So you can see where it's yellow, that's 100%. The deformers are affecting it, and then we've got like a nice soft fall off, and the face is, it's not being affected at all. So turning on the extra turbulence modifiers, we're just getting like an extra sort of ripple. There's now a turbulent field in there, and all the points are kind of just being subtly manipulated by that particle, the turbulent field, and we're just starting to get like a nice subtle sort of flow to the animation. So combined with the keyframe animation, you're starting to bring this thing to life. And lastly, there's an extra jiggle deformer, and that's kind of looking at everything that's happening above it. And then it's doing another layer of interpolation where it can kind of just smooth things out, add a little bit more rubbery sort of feel to it. And probably the second best feature of the Jiggle Deformer is having its own caching system. So any of this animation I could just cache directly in the deformer, and it lives in the scene file, and I could pass that to a different scene file. It's super helpful for production to have the jiggle being able to cache. So if I turn back on the other objects and turn on their respective deformers, you start to see that everything's animating. We've got the keyframe animation that's doing a lot of the movement, but then we have all this additional sort of pushing and pulling of the points, and we're looking at this at almost real time. So this is a big key for any sort of animation work, is that you need that real-time feedback, because otherwise you're just kind of working in the dark. And what I wanted to kind of show was it doesn't really matter if you're working with a low polygon mesh for this particular stage, because you can always apply it to a high-density mesh, and Cinema is able to move the animation from the low polygon into the high polygon mesh, and you can do it in fractions of the speed compared to actually doing all this animation to the high polygon count. So if I come over to the layers and start to turn these on, I just stop that. So now we're kind of exposing the high polygon sculpture. I actually want to just, with my display tag, just come back up to the low polygon mesh and switch these guys over to lines. So what we're looking at is the low polygon mesh used as a cage around the high polygon sculpture, but it's pretty much black, and that's because there's so much detail in the line work that at a camera distance, we're pretty much just seeing detail. So you can see, like, if I was working with this sculpted version of the model, it'd be really taxing on the computer. It'd be really expensive. So this is just a way to just alleviate that extra processing. So I can just switch this over to shading. And actually, I probably don't even need to see the low poly at this stage. And so now we've applied the animation into the high polygon count with our mesh deformer. So if I just open this up, the high polygon sculpture is just referencing all of the point level animation from our low version, and it's being applied, relatively fast. I can press play, and this will definitely chug. But if I was to do like a render blast or something just to get feedback, I'm probably going to get it back in, say, a minute or two, opposed to 10 or 20 if I was doing it all the animation on the high sculpting mesh. So just going back to the keynote for a second. And yeah, this is how it all turned out in context. Okay. So actually wrapped up a little earlier than I thought I'd be, but I just wanted to say thank you for everyone to coming out and hang out with us today. Really appreciate your time. Want to say thank you to the Maxon family for inviting me out here. It's a great honor and privilege to do this sort of stuff. And if you want to get at me, it's my website, email, and Twitter. And I'll hang around for some questions afterwards. Thank you.